Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the VP of Production Services at Games for Change, Emily Treat.
Hello. So earlier we heard from Jane about the future of gaming, and so now we're going to hear about the present situation with games from two perspectives, indie and industry. Please join me in welcoming two great folks here. We have from the Entertainment Software Association, Erik Huey, and first, indie extraordinaire, Gage.
Wow, indie extraordinaire. I don't know about that. Sorry, you have to excuse my voice. I've been sick for a couple weeks and I've recovered, but my voice hasn't yet. Thanks for inviting me here. I've never been to this conference. I don't know a whole lot about it, and so I figured you guys probably also might not know a whole lot about me. So I thought I'd do a very, very brief introduction. I'm an artist. I've been making video games for a little more than 4 years, and I've been making art professionally for a little bit more than 7. I've made big things like this installation at the Venice Biennale. I've made small things like this fortune teller that finds inspiration from Twitter. I've made art games like Lose Lose, which is on the left, which is a game that deletes a file on your computer every time you kill an alien on the screen, and Killing Spree on the right, which puts the faces of the actual gallery goers surrounding you in real life onto characters in a first-person shooter while you play. I've made board games like Guts of Glory, which we just recently shipped, and I made video games, some of which, like Spell Tower in kind of the middle, and Ridiculous Fishing, have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. So, thanks. So I call myself an artist. I'm kind of all over the map, but enough about that. So when they invited me to do this talk, it took me a really long time to say yes. I think probably they weren't so happy about that. For me, the biggest stumbling block about giving this kind of talk was this idea of, like, how can one person give the State of the Union for indies? Who am I to do that, or who's really anybody to do that? And what would I talk about? What are the biggest things that indies are dealing with today? You know, do I talk about the new wave of indies coming in and how now that the ground is looking really fertile, we have all these new faces? It's been really interesting seeing how indies have shifted in the last 4 years that I've been involved. I remember talking to my friend Andy Nealon, one of the people behind Osmos, which was a very early iOS success, a couple years ago, and I was complaining about how hard it was to make a living making independent games. And I remember very clearly he told me no one makes a living making independent games. And I looked around at all of my friends who were, some of them, very well-known indies, and I realized that he was right. Nearly all of us had spent years working on this before it ever became profitable, if it did. So maybe I should talk about that. Maybe I should talk about how indies are worried about what's going to happen with this new wave of people who've quit their jobs to do this job, and how we're worried about what their expectations are, and how even those of us who found success really don't know what the future holds. That's something I could talk about. Or maybe I could talk about how everyone seems to be worried about discoverability lately. Now that there are going to be so many indie games, how will consumers find them? I could talk about what a disaster Steam Greenlight felt like inside the indie community, and how we're worried about what will come next and how Steam will try to address this problem. Or maybe I could talk about how indies are amazingly proactive, how even though we're worried about discoverability, we're also taking steps to solve this problem ourselves. How indies have built services like itch.io and the Humble Bundle so that we can have some control over how we sell our own games. How indies built software like PressKit so that we could be clearer in messaging that surrounded our software. And then we open sourced that, and it's being used by the whole community. I could talk about how indies have gotten better at speaking as I've been watching them speak, and how we've overflowed the Indie Summit at GDC, and now we're spilling out into main conferences there and hundreds of other conferences, not to mention our own conferences. Maybe that's it. Maybe I talk about how indies are making our own conferences, how we're creating our own communities. I can talk about how amazingly encompassing indies are and how this year's Indiecade East was so popular that people stood on long lines to get into every single talk, and how those talks featured some of the broadest and most inclusive selection of speakers that I've ever seen at a conference, game or otherwise. Maybe I could talk about the incredible work that indies are doing to promote diversity and inclusion, to change the frankly ridiculous white male-dominated demographics of video game creators. Maybe I talk about the conferences that indies are creating to push this change themselves, conferences like Different Games, or Lost Levels, or Critical Proximity, or learning initiatives like the Code Liberation Foundation. That sounds like the kind of thing that I should talk about. Maybe it's not just how the conferences that are indies are engaged in, though, but also all the active curation that they're doing. From parties like Wild Rumpus to indie DIY galleries like Baby Castles to full-fledged SF MoMA shows like Arcade, or even the fact that indies are now in the permanent collection at the MoMA. Maybe I should talk about how 4 of the 5 games that they included that are modern, games after 2004, are indie games. And the 5th game, Portal, was based off of an indie game. Maybe I should talk about why that's happening and how it's because indies are so diverse. That's something to talk about. Maybe I should talk about how the games industry has never seen narrative explored the way Cart Life or Papers, Please explores it. How the games industry has never had titles as brave as Dysphoria, as deeply considered as Sound Self, or as personal and poetic as Howling Dogs. Indie games address an ever-widening breadth and diversity of human experience because they're made by an ever-widening breadth and diversity of humans. Or maybe I just talk about how indie games are everywhere. And indie games are more important now than they ever have been. Maybe I talk about how consoles are suddenly being overrun with indie titles. And maybe it's indies that are swaying the needle this console generation in favor of PlayStation. It's impossible to really know what kind of an impact we're having, but it's pretty astonishing that when you look at the 150 titles coming out this year for the PS4, that more than a third of them are indie games. And many of those titles are exclusive to the PlayStation. Maybe I should talk about how Towerfall, a title developed by 5 people, had a better Metacritic score than Titanfall, a game developed by hundreds that came out the same day. Or maybe I talk about Twitch TV and how spectatorship is changing the way the public engages with video games. How indies are leading the charge with features like Daily Challenge and Spelunky, which is a single specific configuration of levels that changes every day and you only get one shot at, and for those reasons has proven really popular with streamers. Or maybe I talk about how Vlambeer is streaming the entire development of their latest game, Nuclear Throne, online. And through that, people are learning about what it really takes to develop a video game. Or maybe I talk about Choice Chamber, a recently kickstarted, massively multiplayer game that streamers can literally play against all of their fans who are watching on Twitch and can interact through the chat. Name one AAA game that's exploring these totally groundbreaking interactions. TV companies have been trying to launch companion apps for sporting events and game shows for years, and Twitch and indie developers are managing to do it right under their noses. Or maybe I should talk about how in 2011, Cliff Bleszinski gave a talk about power creatives and how they could shape companies without realizing that he was talking about indie devs and that indies don't need to wrestle power from investors. Indies don't need investors, and that's what having power is. How indies are getting better at self-promotion and how consumers are starting to expect to be able to put a face and a name to a game, not just a company. Or how so many kids these days are turning not to large news websites for their information, but to live streamers, micro-communities centered around amazing hardworking fans turned professional gamers. People like Man vs. Game, or Red Panda Gamer, or PewDiePie, or Total Biscuit. Maybe I should talk about how the internet of the future is an internet of micro-communities, and how the individuals at the head of those communities would rather deal with people than companies, indies than AAA. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that despite how amazing all of these achievements feel, none of them are really what's important about indie games to me. But to explain that, I have to take a step back and talk about games as a whole for a moment. See, we know this, right? Games are a complex experiential art form. We talk about how hard games are to make a lot. But in a lot of ways, games are very simple to make. They're so simple that children make them. All children design games by themselves, with each other. You don't even have to buy them markers. Not only that, but games are kind of accessible in such a huge way that any human, any normal human has no problem issuing house rules for the board games they play with their friends or family. Every single person you've ever met was once a practicing game designer and likely has been a game modder. Hell, even many of your friends' pets are game designers. So how can these things be so complicated and so simple at the same time? One of my friends, Frank Lance, gave a great talk at GDC this year called Hearts and Minds, where he talked about how games sit right in the center of the two worlds problem. That games are both rationalist understandings and emotional understandings. This seems complicated, right, to wrangle those two parts. But to me, those two parts, that's what the world is. Reality is equal parts arts and science. These two disciplines aren't naturally split apart. They've been taken apart because of how we teach them. And I think that's why everyone understands games, because games are a clear reflection of the world in its entirety. Games are about experience, and life is about experience. And that's why we can all understand games. That's why we can all make games. And now that games are returning to our culture, I think we all will make games. I really love that games are everywhere. I love that code.org teaches people to program by having them program games. When I learned to code, we learned on a command line, and it was really boring for most of the people I know. Now, you can kick off your code education by making games, so a lot more people are learning to code. Why is that? Maybe it's because making games is more fun than staring at a blinking text prompt. So these programmers who would normally have slaved away at terminals can now have fun at the same time. These programmers will get to cut their teeth making games so that they can go on to live their dreams of writing enterprise backends for business applications. No, right? They want to make games. That's why learning how to code while making games works, because you cut right to the chase. You learn how to code to make games so that you can make games. It's a real bonus, though, that these skills are applicable in so many additional fields. And this is really where video games are starting to redefine their cultural status. Like, I'm an artist, and honestly, it's pretty amazing that my mom let me grow up as an artist, because we know nobody makes money as an artist. But I want to tell you about a new field of art. It's a field that anyone can understand. It's a type of art that you can carry in your pocket sometimes. It's a practice that teaches you how to program computers, and maybe how to make visual art, and maybe how to make music, and probably how to work as a team, and definitely how to think about systems. And it might teach you to understand other people better, and it might teach you a little bit about business, and if you're really lucky, people might pay for it. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, because we're all here at a conference about games. I'm talking about making games. And what's so special about this field is exactly what makes it so strange and complicated. Games force us to tackle mathematical learning and creative learning at the same time. It's near impossible to argue that kids making games aren't learning serious, viable career skills at the same time that they're honing their creativity, something that's been sorely lacking in the educational system as of late. Here we have a composite practice that isn't just art or just business, and finally, it's becoming accessible, viable, and acceptable to do. And that's why every day more and more people are making games. And it's not just shooters and platformers and puzzle games. We make games that don't fit into genre molds, games that are poems or experiences or experiments or songs or places to visit. Games that constantly redefine what a game can even be. And we make these games for ourselves as much as we make them for each other. And that's what it is to be an indie, because indies are the rest of us. And when you look at it like that, who really cares what's going to happen with Steam? Or if Kickstarter is overplayed? Who cares what the few thousand people in the indie scene are worried about right now? And also, Another thing I wanted to talk about here is games for change are fine, but games don't need to be for change. Just because games might make a new kind of tool doesn't mean that they are tools. Half of playing games as a kid is making games. And finally, we're at a point where that's beginning to happen for video games in the broader culture. We don't need to just consume this medium. We're at a point where the tools are there and the culture is getting there for us to take part in creating this medium. Make games. Teach making games. Making games is infinitely better than playing tools. Making games itself is change, bigger change than playing games will ever be. And spreading that culture of making is the change we need. And that's what indies do best. They spread the culture and the allure of making games. The thing is, indie isn't a corporation, it's not a group, it's not a country, it's not a mailing list. And unlike AAA, indie isn't a product or an aspirational level of quality. Indie games is a medium. It's a medium that's new, and it's a medium that changes everything. And how can you give a state of a union for a medium? You can't. And that's the best part about it. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, here to join Zach is Erik Huey to present the state of the industry.
Thank you. I'm Erik Huey. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Entertainment Software Association. And thank you to Games for Change for giving us this opportunity. Thank you, Aussie, and the whole Games for Change team. You've put together an amazing program. The coverage has been terrific, and congratulations on a great continuation and revamping of a terrific brand in its 11th year. I run government affairs for the video game industry, which is a lot of fun. We are ESA. We are the trade association for the $22 billion domestic U.S. industry, and our 35 members comprise some household names that you know well, like Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, Sega, Activision, Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, Warner Brothers, Disney, Take-Two here in New York. We run E3, which is the annual trade show. I'm sure several of you, many of you have been out there. We do government affairs for the industry. We also run the industry's legal affairs. We enforce anti-piracy and content protection and technology policy, and we also operate the ESRB, which is the ratings board, and Pat Vance, who's the president and CEO of the ESRB, is somewhere out here in the audience. And she does terrific work in a quickly evolving field. And we're going to talk a little bit about where this is going. Pong was 42 years ago, which seems like an eternity, but in terms of an evolved, mature industry, it's actually pretty, it's fairly recent. And when you think about how this evolved, through the Atari console in 2600, through Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, and where we are now, it's like Moore's Law on speed. The Xbox One and the capabilities that the Kinect technology enables is pardon the pun, is literally game-changing. Your mind, your face, your voice are the controls. The controller is no longer part of the game. And obviously, the computing power in new consoles like the Sony PlayStation 4 and the Wii U are astronomically beyond what they were even a short 10 years ago. And we're truly excited to see what happens with the next generation of technology. We're constantly seeing innovation and evolution with developments like the Mobius and Oculus Rift, which is on display outside. So, as Zach talked a little bit about, and a number of speakers have talked about today, basically everybody is a gamer. We were recently out in California and meeting with one of the legislative leaders there, and he said, I got to admit, I know this is an important industry to this state, and it's kind of the future of the innovation economy, but I'm not really much of a gamer. He said, I don't have a console. And then his staffer said, well, you play Angry Birds. He said, oh yeah, I play Angry Birds, I play Words with Friends, and he listed about 5 other casual games that he played, Farmville, and we kind of informed him that he kind of was a gamer, but he didn't necessarily realize it. 2/3 of households have game consoles. The smartphone tablet revolution is a phenomenon that it just continues. I mean, as often as we update these statistics, they're almost out of date by the time we get this. So those will change shortly, because I think when you look at the uses for smartphones and tablets, gaming is on the rise. Even Frank Underwood, for those of you who watch House of Cards, is a big gamer. And he's not the only member of Congress, I might add. As you may recall the John McCain stories during one of the congressional hearings, but there are others. The demographic in Congress is reflective of the changing demographic in throughout America. 45% of all gamers are women. 20% of gamers are over the age of 50. And when you look at people over 50, we've done a lot of work lately on some partnerships with the AARP, and we released a study that MPD Research conducted for us, which was a survey. And half of all people over the age of 50 play games, and 80% of those play them once a week. 50% play every single day. And I'm sure many of you have a grandmother or grandfather who just can't get enough of Angry Birds. So the demographic is shifting, and that's reflective of the expansion of the console base, but also these new platforms, including Facebook, Google, Amazon, and elsewhere. So a lot of people think of our industry, and they think of it as a predominantly California-based industry split between Northern and Southern California. Or they might think of Austin, Texas, or they might think of Seattle, maybe Boston. But in reality, we're a nationwide phenomenon, because as Zach, and that's increasing, because as Zach noted, if you've got a broadband connection and some coding skills and a garage, that's all you need to start the next indie gaming company. And many of our members started in garages, some decades ago, some as recently as 4 or 5 years ago. This is a pretty interesting map, because it really helped us conceptualize, and it helps policymakers conceptualize the degree to which this industry is pervasive in their district. Because at the end of the day, an elected member of Congress they care a lot about what happens to the country, but they really care about what happens in their district. And what we're able to demonstrate is looking at the facilities of our 35 members, which are 35 of the largest companies in the video game space. They have 106 facilities in 48 throughout the country in 48 different congressional districts. That means there are 48 members of Congress, actually plus 2 senators for each of those, so about 150 members of Congress that have a video game production facility and video game jobs in their industry. And then when you layer up, we're going to animate this eventually, when you put in the layer next of all of the indie gamers, and you on gamedev.map and start to filter those in, then you're really filling out the map. And then if you put in the ranking of the Princeton Review top 25 undergraduate and top 25 graduate schools for game design, you really start to fill in the map. And then when you layer on top of that the other 383 schools that teach video game programming as part of their curriculum, you have a pretty fulsome picture of where this industry is and where it's going. You guys have seen these stats before. We think about Games for Change, the first Games for Change 11 years ago. Our revenue has doubled as an industry since then, and that is, with the Great Recession right in the middle of that. What's interesting about this chart is the light blue area, because you see we were at the end of a console run in 2012, so it's natural to see the sale of console games declining somewhat. But what's interesting is the growth continued with the light blue area, which is mobile gaming and digital gaming and all things digital. So for a while we only measured, or the powers that be only measured in terms of the size of the industry in terms of console games, but that's kind of like measuring the size of the music industry without looking at iTunes and Spotify and Pandora. So we're expanding the definition of what it means to be a video game, and that's reflective of where the technology is heading. You've seen the numbers on GTA 5. It is the largest entertainment opening of all time. It did $1 billion in sales in 3 days. So when you look at the #1 movie of all time, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 did $91 million in its first day. GTA 5 did $800 million in its first day, almost 10x, more than the largest movie of all time. When you look at the Avengers, which is the largest combined 4-day box office, it grossed $207 million in 3 days. GTA 5 did $1 billion. And then we've got other juggernauts like certainly like Battlefield, certainly like FIFA, Madden, and Call of Duty, and Minecraft. Kind of speaking of things that came out of the indie world, 100 million registered users. And then there are apps. 8 of the top apps last year in the App Store were games. 63% of the App Store revenue comes from games. Angry Birds, which I've mentioned, downloaded almost 2 billion times. That's, I have to do the quick math, that's what, 1 out of every 4 people on the planet has download Angry Birds. And the free version earns $1 million a year from ads. And then digital sales keep increasing. We're changing our business model, and again, that's reflective of where the consumers are going. And as our consumer base expands, we have to offer them challenging new products. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about what's happening in the indie space. And Sony was very quick to embrace this because they don't see these as 2 different verticals or even flip sides of the same coin. They see the indie world in the same way that they is part of the same ecosystem as they see the much larger AAA title world. Cloud gaming is taking over. It's expected to reach 66 million households by 2017, and social gaming continues to grow. As Ken Weber will tell you, Zynga currently has 232 monthly users and is putting up some impressive revenue numbers. So why are we succeeding? You're all gamers. You all understand fundamentally that the mechanics in gaming are fun, it's interesting, it's social. We are actually, because of the technology, we're more resistant, although not entirely resistant, to piracy than movies or music, and we're constantly innovating on that front. The social experience, people, Jane McGonigal talked about this, there's a fundamental human need to socialize, and this enables this. I've got good friends who are Iraqi war veterans, and these are tough guys, Army Rangers, and these are not guys who would pick up a phone ever and say, hey, how you doing? But they keep in touch with the people that they served with. Every Tuesday night at 11, they have a standing Call of Duty hour, which generally stretches well into the night with the headsets on, and it's a great way to socialize. Again, we see our core audience widening, and then we're morphing our business models to give consumers what they want. And the free-to-play games, somebody mentioned earlier, you couldn't necessarily have foreseen this phenomenon, but when you look at all digital revenue in video games, a quarter of it is free to play, and we expect that to grow. So when you go back to that map, and you see where these jobs are, we've got about 120,000 direct and indirect jobs in 38 different states. As I mentioned, over 380, almost 400 colleges and universities have video game design. The Princeton Review now ranks those. And the kids coming out of these programs have an average starting salary that's double the starting salary for all college graduates. And the great thing about it is we're educating not just software engineers, we're also educating graphic designers. So it's a real right brain, left brain industry. And New York is among the states that are at the forefront of this. We've got 5 schools in New York State that are on the Princeton Review list: NYU Poly, Rensselaer, RIT, Parsons, and University of Buffalo. When you think about a place like upstate New York, that's where Vicarious Visions was started. 2 brothers started this company, again, in their garage. So there's no geographic monopoly on creativity in this space. We often used to say, we're the bridge between Silicon Valley and Hollywood, but we've taken that bridge and we've sent it to the other 49 states and also worldwide, which is why so many states have passed tax incentives to entice our industry to come to their states. 22 states and counting. There are some ones that are not yellow yet, but I'm working on that. The great ESA government affairs team, because these are the jobs that people want. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in Salt Lake City, in places like Orlando, Florida, places you wouldn't necessarily think are hubs of our industry, we're growing and we're expanding. The Baton Rouge EA facility is a pretty interesting partnership. It was a partnership with Stephen Murray and Governor, who's the economic development coordinator for the state, Governor Bobby Jindal, the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Association, as well as LSU and Electronic Arts. And it's a growing facility there. They just built a gorgeous new building, and you can see why states like Texas and others have invested a lot of money in attracting. And Texas is an amazing case study in that we have doubled the size of jobs in the state of Texas in our industry since their incentive was passed in 2008 and then updated a couple of years thereafter. It's now the #2 state for video game jobs in the country, leapfrogging Washington, which is the home of Microsoft and Nintendo. So we've talked a little bit about how big this industry is. Zach talked about this amazing ecosystem. I mean, I'm the frontman for an indie rock band, so I just naturally love the indie scene, and I think it's just such an amazing thing that's happening there. And so what? What does that mean? I think that's what we're here to figure out this week, and what Games for Change has been looking at for the last 11 years. What can we do with this technology? Because it's incredibly immersive, it's incredibly innovative, and it's incredibly creative. And when you talk to the people who work for our companies, the indies that Zach described, they fundamentally believe in the transformative power of video games. They believe it's genetically encoded. They think that video games can make the world a better place. And I think as we'll find out this week, they can. Thank you.